All right, welcome everyone to the virtual launch of the Atlantic Provinces chapter of Canada in a Changing Climate Regional Perspectives Report and the launch of Atlantic Canada's new climate services hub, CLIMAtlantic. My name is Raisa Marks. I'm one of the contributing authors of the report, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're gathering virtually throughout Atlantic Canada and beyond. Atlantic Canada is a part of the unceded and traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, Pescatawamukadi, Innu, and Inuit peoples. We encourage you all, if you're comfortable, to share your own land acknowledgements in the chat box. It's also important to note as we launch these two resources today that people across this region are already experiencing the impacts of our changing climate, most recently the torrential rains that took out roads and bridges in Cape Breton and Newfoundland. Today's launch of the Atlantic Provinces chapter has been co-organized by the Coastal and Ocean Information Network Atlantic, CLIMAtlantic, and Environment and Climate Change Canada and Natural Resources Canada, which leads Canada's National Knowledge Assessment process. So throughout the event today, please type any questions you might have into the question and answer box in Zoom, and there will have 3 different Q&A sessions spread throughout the webinar. So feel free to direct your questions to a specific speaker, or if you don't do that, then the question will just be posed to the general panel. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible in the time frame that we have. And we also welcome you to share your thoughts with us in the chat box. For example, you can let us know which key messages resonate with you and how it might influence your work. On vous encourage aussi à poser des questions en français si vous voulez. For your convenience, the PowerPoint presentations have been translated into French, and a link to those will be shared in the chat. The ones that we're going to show here are going to be the English ones. And there's also interpretation available from French to English and English to French. And you can find that by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting your preferred language. If you're having any technical difficulties through the webinar, you can let us know in the chat box, or you can send an email to coinatlantic@dal.ca. That's coinatlantic@dal.ca, and we'll do our best to help you out. So today's webinar will provide an overview of Canada in a Changing Climate, the National Knowledge Assessment, and then the authors of the Atlantic Provinces chapter will discuss the chapter's key messages. We're going to start with some recorded remarks from the Honourable Yvonne Jones, Member of Parliament for Labrador and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources, the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson. Et ensuite, ça va être suivi par l'Honorable Stephen Guilbeault, Ministre de l'Environnement et du Changement Climatique.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Jones, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Labrador and a Parliamentary Secretary for Natural Resources to Minister Jonathan Wilkinson. I am joining you this morning from the traditional ancestral territory of the Algonquin people, and I am very grateful for this opportunity to talk about one of the most critical topics of our time, climate change. As an individual who lives in Canada's north, we understand every day the rapid changes of climate and the impact it has on our lives, our culture, and our communities. I truly believe Canadians can be proud of the progress our country has made in the fight against climate change over the last 6 years. But I also know we still have work to do. For example, we talk a lot about mitigation, making the impacts of climate change less severe by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we should. But there are also much needed conversations to be had on the importance of adaptation, and we must be ready to anticipate the impact of climate change and take the appropriate action to prevent or minimize the damage they can cause. According to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the total damage from weather-related events last year was $2.4 billion, the 4th highest year of insured losses since 1983. That alone tells us that mitigation and adaptation are two sides of the same coin, and they must go hand in hand. In places all over Canada, we've seen how serious the results can be. Just last month, we saw the destruction that was left by an Atlantic Canadian storm, which caused about 200 millimeters of rain to fall on parts of Cape Breton and in my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador. leaving some rural communities cut off from the rest of their province. Across the country in British Columbia, we've just seen them endure a year of record forest fires, deadly heat domes, and recently devastating floods. These are stark reminders that the question is no longer whether we act, but how. This is why the release of the latest chapter in our Regional Perspectives report is so important. As part of our ongoing series of national assessment reports written from the Atlantic perspective, this report details what residents of this region already know from firsthand experience, that climate change is having a deep and lasting impact on Atlantic communities, their economies, and the environment. There are some inescapable conclusions in the report. First, as I mentioned, climate change is amplifying existing flood risk in Atlantic Canada's coastal areas and other parts of the region that are prone to flooding and erosion. Second, people living in Atlantic Canada are facing significant risk to their health, physically and mentally, and their well-being because of our changing climate. Third, Indigenous experiences can and should inform adaptation in Atlantic Canada. Indigenous peoples have occupied the Atlantic region since time immemorial. They've adapted to changes in climate and the environment over countless generations, and their knowledge is key in this fight against climate change. Fourth, Atlantic Canada's natural resource industries like forestry, agriculture, and fisheries are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And finally, partnerships and collaboration between government, stakeholders, NGOs, academia, Indigenous communities, and the private sector are going to be key to driving adaptation action in the Atlantic region. Climate change is a shared problem that requires shared responsibility. All levels of government have a critical role to play to find long-term solutions. Adaptation takes a coordinated approach because it has to be successful. That's why these regional reports are essential. They help inform sound, thoughtful actions. So thank you to all the authors who contributed their expertise and their knowledge to this project. Let me also congratulate Environment and Climate Change under new Regional Climate Center, CLIMAtlantic. This important resource will help support these smart adaptation policies moving forward. The science is clear. Each of the last 3 decades has seen the warmest on record, and warming in the Arctic is occurring twice as fast as the rest of the world. Canada's climate is changing, and we need to adapt to ensure our communities, our environment, and our economy are resilient. But while climate change is the greatest challenge of our generation, it can also be the biggest opportunity of our lifetimes. Canada has what it takes to thrive in the low carbon economy of the future. If we are thoughtful in our approaches and ambitious in our actions, we can seize these opportunities by working together and finding made in Canada solutions. We can build a future that works for all regions of our country, for all parts of our economy, and for all Canadians. I wish you well as we continue this important work together. Thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning everyone. Je suis Stephen Guilbeault, ministre de l'Environnement et du Changement climatique. Je vous remercie toutes et tous de vous être joints à nous aujourd'hui pour souligner le lancement du nouveau carrefour régional sur le climat dans les provinces de l'Atlantique, CLIMAtlantic, et la publication du chapitre sur les provinces de l'Atlantique du rapport intitulé « Le Canada dans un climat en changement, rapport sur les perspectives régionales ». Tout d'abord, je tiens aussi à remercier toutes les personnes qui ont travaillé de façon soutenue pour concrétiser ces projets. Comme je l'ai déjà dit, les changements climatiques ne sont pas une préoccupation pour un avenir éloigné. Ils sont bien réels et les Canadiens et Canadiennes d'un océan à l'autre en ressentent déjà les effets. Atlantic Canadians, you experience your fair share of climate-related challenges. Each year, PEI loses about a foot of land from coastal erosion. The cause is ever more powerful storms fueled by a warming ocean. A few weeks ago, you experienced a severe storm that brought strong winds and unprecedented rainfall, along with floodings and washouts. En plus des mesures que nous avons prises pour lutter contre les changements climatiques et réduire nos émissions au cours des dernières années, notamment par la voie du plan climatique renforcé du Canada, nous savons que les phénomènes météorologiques extrêmes liés au climat seront présents dans un avenir proche. Pensons entre autres aux incendies de forêt, aux inondations et aux tempêtes et sécheresses extrêmes. Les effets sont réels, ici même, chez nous. Nous devons donc partir du bon pied en matière de résilience et d'adaptation. That is why I cannot overstate the importance of the initiatives being launched today. To those of you who've made CLIMAtlantic a reality, know that your work will help inform our country's national adaptation strategy, help countless Canadians and their communities. The Government of Canada will provide nearly $1.65 million over 3 years to support CLIMAtlantic, which joins our country's growing network of regional climate organizations. CLIMAtlantic will help your communities access authoritative climate data. It will help you make informed, evidence-based decisions to boost your safety and improve climate resilience. Encore une fois, permettez-moi de féliciter tous ceux et celles qui ont travaillé à ces 2 importants projets. Bonne chance dans votre travail et merci de votre inestimable contribution aux mesures du Canada dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques. Merci.
We thank Minister Guilbeault and Parliamentary Secretary Jones for those messages. I'd now like to pass it off to Fiona Warren, the Knowledge Assessment Manager at Natural Resources Canada, to provide us with an overview of Canada's national assessment process.
Great. Thanks very much, Risa, for the introduction. So I am the Knowledge Assessment Manager within the Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Division at Natural Resources Canada, where we lead Canada's national assessment process, Canada and the Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action. And I am so delighted to be here today with everyone to mark the release of the Atlantic Provinces chapter. This chapter represents the hard work and the commitment of so many people. And I'd like to just take a quick minute before I dive into my presentation to thank and gratefully acknowledge the contributing authors, all the coordinating lead authors, all the reviewers who contributed, the advisory committee who've been with us since the beginning and will hopefully be with us until the end, and as well the small and passionate team at NRCan who work so hard behind the scenes to make sure that these reports on these important topics are completed to the highest standard and make it into the hands of Canadians. So thank you all. Next slide, please. So today I'll be providing some background information on our assessment process, as well as the Regional Perspectives report, and I'll quickly introduce you to our webpage where you can access the reports. The goal is to provide the context for the presentations that follow on the Atlantic Provinces chapter. Next slide, please. So when we talk about assessment, science assessments or knowledge assessments, we're referring to products, generally reports, that are designed through the process to be credible, useful, and decision relevant. They always synthesize and assess existing knowledge. And in this case, that definition is quite broad. It includes the peer-reviewed scientific literature, broader literature such as government reports, as well as other sources of important knowledge such as Indigenous knowledge and practitioner knowledge. And they all focus on climate change risks, opportunities, and adaptation. In terms of the scope and goals and approach of our assessments, they're quite similar to the IPCC Working Group 2 reports. And we've been leading these assessments at NRCan since the mid-2000s. There's a few examples of our previous reports there on the screen. In terms of the main goals, they are to raise awareness of the issues and to provide a foundation and information for decision-making. They also help us through the involvement build capacity on adaptation through the assessment development process. Next slide, please. So we launched our current process, Canada and a Changing Climate, at the end of 2016. And during this process, we're releasing a total of 6 reports. We're able to do so many reports as we're working with so many different people, as well as appreciating the leadership of other federal departments. The first report in the process, Canada's Changing Climate Report, was co-developed and released with Environment and Climate Change Canada. That came out in 2019. And that report looked at how and why the climate has changed and how it will continue to change in the future. As such, this report really provided the climate science foundation for the subsequent reports, which all focus on climate change impacts and adaptation. So the second report to be released was the National Issues Report, which came out in June, at the end of June this year. And that report looks at issues that are of national importance or that are best understood through an integrated pan-Canadian perspective. So as the Atlantic chapter touches on the key priorities for the region, some of these topics you can find more detail from a national perspective within the National Issues Report. Topics such as water resources, ecosystem services, the economic impacts, costs and benefits of climate change, and the impacts on communities of all sizes are covered in this report. The Regional Perspectives Report is the third report, I guess, we're releasing. I'll speak more about that on the next slide. But I just want to pull your attention to the fact that in the winter, January or February, there will be a health assessment, which is being produced by Health Canada, which will be coming out. And that looks at the health impacts and adaptation on both the health of Canadians, but also the healthcare system. In the final phase of the program, there will be a report focused on Indigenous resilience, as well as a synthesis report. And all of these reports are or will be available on our website, changingclimate.ca. Next slide, please. So the Regional Perspectives Report provides a regional perspective on regional priorities and how climate change is impacting our communities, our environment, and our economy, and how we are adapting. Each of these chapters includes a number of case stories, which look at adaptation in practice and are an excellent resource to see what people are doing or what action is being taken on adaptation. Now we're releasing this report on a slightly different basis. The chapters are being released as available on a rolling basis. The first chapter to be released was the Prairie Provinces chapter, which came out about a year ago, December 2020, and that's available on our website. The Atlantic Provinces is the second chapter to be released, and the remaining 4 chapters will be released over the winter and spring 2022. Next slide, please. So while we lead the process at NRCan, we rely on the efforts and contribution of many, many people from across the country, from many different groups. This includes academia, all levels of government, NGOs, Indigenous organizations, the private sector. We couldn't do it without these contributions. In the case of the Regional Perspectives Report, over 230 experts contributed, and this included 17 coordinating lead authors, 100 contributing authors, our 20-member advisory committee, as well as 100 expert reviewers. And I just want to flag quickly the importance of the review process to our assessments. The expert review process is really what helps us ensure that the chapters are both accurate and relevant for the target audiences. Next chapter, please. Next slide, please. So just in terms of, so as I said, we've been leading assessments at NRCan for quite a while now, and these are just some of the highlights of what's new and different in the current process. First is that we're doing a suite of products, so 6 reports rather than a single report over the time period. The second is that we've put a much greater focus on enhancing the engagement and communications. So that was before we started in terms of scoping. During the process, we tried to maintain, we did surveys and outreach through our website to keep people updated, and we will continue this after release. We've also structured the chapters a little bit differently using a key message approach, which allows the chapters to provide layers of information so that will address the needs of different audiences. So there's high-level statements, plain language summaries, and then more of a traditional assessment text below. There's also boxes located throughout, and as I mentioned, a number of case stories. We also put a much greater focus on the inclusion of multiple sources of knowledge, including, and specifically in this case, Indigenous knowledge. We also asked all the authors to explicitly discuss the knowledge gaps and emerging issues with respect to their region. And this is to help us establish a baseline looking forward. Finally, all of the chapters and reports are fully designed for digital delivery. Next slide, please. So being able to deliver all our reports online, we've noticed they are accessed a lot more, which is our top goal, which is excellent. It also allows us to incorporate more features, and some of these are listed here. So there you will, if you visit our website, you will find videos embedded throughout the different chapters and the different reports. All of the content is also shareable. It's also searchable. Many figures are available and they can be downloaded. Some of these are interactive. It also allowed us to have a greater connectivity both within and between the chapters and the different reports. Our website also has a frequently asked questions section where you can learn more about the assessment process. And there's also a case story map. Next slide, please. So the case story map is called the Map of Adaptation Actions, and this was produced in collaboration with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And what it is an interactive searchable map that has examples of adaptation from across Canada. And these include both the case stories from the national assessment process and also a number of case studies that have been compiled by Environment and Climate Change Canada. This is targeted primarily towards decision makers and adaptation practitioners and can be found at the same site, /case studies. In terms of the Atlantic region, there are, I believe, a total of 40 case stories there as of today. Next slide, please. So with that, I would like to conclude, just encouraging everyone to visit the website, changingclimate.ca, to view the chapter, the report, the other reports. You can also check out the FAQs, share findings. If you're interested in more information on the assessment process, you can visit our NRCan page. Also happy to answer questions by email. After the event today, there's our adaptation mailbox link there, as well as my personal email. So thank you very much, and back to you, Risa.
Thanks very much, Fiona. So I just want to take a quick minute to remind you all that if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please put them into the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as possible during the Q&A sessions. So we're now going to hear from the author team of the Atlantic Provinces chapter, who will be sharing its key messages. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sabina Dietz and Stephanie Arnold, who will be giving an overview of the Atlantic chapter. Sabina has led the Atlantic chapter process development since 2018 and has been an adaptation practitioner since 2010 with a PhD in biology. She's also the executive director of CLIMAtlantic, which will be presented later on today in this webinar. And Stephanie is a PhD researcher with the UPEI Climate Lab and has worked in the adaptation field since 2014. Her research areas include planned adaptation and adaptive capacity. Over to you both.
Thank you, Risa. And first, I would like to acknowledge the support from NRCan throughout this process of developing the Atlantic chapter. Fiona and your team, it's been fantastic, very professional, excellent support. So as we all know, our region is quite diverse, and so are the impacts. And you've heard that in the messages from both Minister Guilbeault as well as Parliamentary Secretary Jones. We only have about 6.5% of Canada's population. In terms of impacts, the temperature has increased by 0.7 degrees Celsius between 1948 and 2016. And this increase has happened mostly in the summer. And of course, what all of us know is the challenges associated with sea level rise, which are projected to increase between 75 and 100 centimeters by 2100. Under high emission scenarios. And of course, this is different depending on where you are in our region. This causes increased coastal flooding with storm surges added to the sea level rise, higher energy waves, reduced shore fast ice in winter, which makes erosion and impacts from flooding more severe, and damages coastal infrastructure and coastal ecosystems. In terms of inland, the increased stream flows have been projected for selected study areas, and these are caused by different factors across the region. A little bit about the approach to our chapter. Of course, as with any of the other chapters, they build on past assessment reports. Very much we relied on regional expertise. We held several workshops and interviews with practitioners and experts during 2018 and 2019. And as you will note from the key messages, the Indigenous participants in the workshops and the meetings decided to develop a standalone key message on Indigenous perspectives. This report is by no means exhaustive, as it is based on the knowledge and expertise of our participants and those that wanted to contribute, and of course, based on previous reports. I have to say there's a lot of work that has gone on in the last 10 years on adaptation across all provinces, where provinces have worked on understanding the regional climate change impacts and have worked on specific climate change risk assessments. There have been numerous tools developed for especially municipalities, and adaptation planning has been undertaken broadly across the region. In our case, now for the Atlantic chapter, the team of authors was really fantastic. There's over 40 individuals that have contributed. And the expertise in our team was very broad, from governments, non-government organizations, from the municipality sector, the private sector, Indigenous perspectives, and academia. So Stephanie, please, we'll introduce the key messages related to the report's focus areas. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So our authors today will share adaptation work that has taken place within Atlantic Canada across a number of sectors: infrastructure, community health and well-being, and natural resources. Each of these sectors employ different adaptation approaches that are locally relevant, using the resources and capacities they have available. This chapter also highlights the unique context that Indigenous communities face, which makes their impacts and challenges unique. The use of Indigenous experiences, knowledge, and perspectives to inform adaptation actions will also be shared today. Despite the different challenges, approaches, and solutions, these cases all share something in common. The groups of practitioners doing this work leverage whatever adaptation capacity they have, and they recognize the need for continual capacity building as well as additional resources. You'll notice that as the authors share this work with us today, the order of the key messages differ from how they're organized within the report. And I'll pass it back to Reza.
Thank you, Sabina and Stephanie. So our next speaker is Tom Johnson. Tom's the Director of Indigenous Knowledge at Mi'kmaq at Plutahan Incorporated. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Raisa. Yes, I am, introduce myself, Tom Johnson. I am actually now the GIS coordinator with Mi'kmaq Plutahan. And what we are seeing here is Lennox Island. This is a Mi'kmaq community in Epigwet, what is now Prince Edward Island. And we can see from the modeling here that the island is slowly disappearing. And this is going to happen over time, and this has happened since time immemorial. We've seen from modeling that 11,000 years ago, Prince Edward Island or Epigwet was not an island. In fact, but over that time, the coastline has receded, and the Mi'kmaq people, being having lived in concert with nature, have lived with this for the since time immemorial. And what's happened here is where they have both summer homes and winter homes. When the ancestors went to their winter homes and then came back to their summer homes on the beach, on the coast, and found that the coastline had receded by a few feet, it was no big deal. They just moved their community back another few feet, and year after year, their communities moved along with the coast. What's happened today, though, is the reserve system has come in and changed that. They've put the reserve system, which came in the early 1800s, put a hard backstop on the size of these communities. Now, what you see here is Lennox Island. There are two other communities in New Brunswick undergoing the same thing: Elnominigog, which is Indian Island near the mouth of the Shpakta River, and Ugapaganjik, which is or Eel River Bar First Nation, which is at the mouth of Eel River. Both of these communities are experience coastal erosion, just like you see here on the Lennox Island map here. And just like Lennox Island, all three of these communities have adapted to this by acquiring more land inland. But unfortunately, in case of Lennox Island, of course, you can't acquire adjacent land. with the other two New Brunswick communities. All the adjacent land was in private hands, so they had to acquire land that is not continuous to the reserve community. So this is one of the downfalls that our Indigenous communities have faced with climate change, and this is how we have adapted. And over time, this is how we've adapted, and continue to this day, going to have to adapt in this manner. But that is basically how we are using GIS to understand our modeling, and to understand what's going to happen next. Now, in the New Brunswick communities, in both Illuminagog and Ugapaganjik, they have built solid defenses, hard defenses, be them seawalls or barriers that are meant to slow down the inevitable, but we all know that it's all going to happen eventually. And now this is not really a First Nation solution. It's a modern solution that we've had to look at to try to mitigate the effects of coastal erosion, because we know that it's going to happen. With that, I really don't have anything else to add, unless, although I will be around for questions during the question period.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Patricia Manuel, who's a professor at Dalhousie University's School of Planning. Patricia conducts research in environmental planning with a focus on climate change adaptation. So over to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Raisa, and welcome everybody to our webinar, and thank you for your interest. So our slide here is showing a key message that climate change is exacerbating the risks to health and well-being of people in Atlantic Canada. And how does that work? So the next slide, I think, with the vulnerability map, thanks. Our East Coast geography exposes us to these increasingly severe weather and ocean impacts of climate change. And this increased exposure to storms, sea level rise, and heat increases the risk to population health and well-being. And some populations are going to be more affected than others. And vulnerability mapping, which is the tool you see here on the slide, is what we can use to identify these areas of higher population risk to climate impacts. Now, this is a map of Nova Scotia showing patterns of social vulnerability for the province using a social vulnerability index. And the red and orange areas, or red and gold areas, are places of higher vulnerability, and the dark green are areas of lower vulnerability. So what is social vulnerability and social vulnerability index, and how does it work? How does it relate to hazards? Some people in society might have a harder time accessing the resources they need to withstand and recover from severe events like hurricanes, floods, ice storms, heat waves, for example. And these resources include things like good quality housing, disposable income. They might spend on emergency supplies or repairs, information about pending emergencies, and connections to family, neighbors, community services for support when they need it. And certain demographic or social and economic factors will contribute to social vulnerability. And those things include being very young or old, for example, or living alone or in a single parent household, or recently immigrated, or lower education levels, lower income, no employment, among others. So these factors are captured in statistics that we collect in the census that you're all familiar with, and National Household Survey. And when a population in a given location area comprises a larger proportion of socially vulnerable groups, then that population may be socially vulnerable. And that's what a social vulnerability index shows, as on this map. So the index itself is built by comparing these demographic and social statistics in smaller census units to a larger comparator unit. And in this case, we're comparing the values in these smaller areas called dissemination areas to the entire province, to the statistics for the entire province. And we group them and then map the result. And this shows the higher and lower social vulnerability across the province. So that's okay, but how do we use it? And it's a good tool that, because it allows us to look at the patterns relative to a hazard. for example, a flood hazard. And that pattern could tell us where populations of higher social vulnerability are located and where they are in relation to the hazard. And then from that, we can work on strategies to change that vulnerability at both the social and community level. So for example, in this case, we overlaid approximations of extreme flood zones on the social vulnerability map to identify areas of social vulnerability to coastal hazard flooding in particular. The map is scalable, and when you zoom it in, you can get a view like the insert shown here. And what you see is the flood zone in blue overlaid on the pattern of social vulnerability, where the higher vulnerability is the gold and red areas. And then we also counted residential properties within this zone. On the example here, the majority of the residential properties impacted by flooding are not actually in the high social vulnerability areas. Now, that doesn't mean that's not a reason for concern, but these populations might be in a better position to manage the impacts or rebound from them than populations of higher vulnerability areas. The areas of higher social vulnerability are places of extensive road networks connecting to important services. And some of those will be impacted by flooding, and people will be cut off or could be cut off from these services they rely upon. So this type of mapping tool is very important for developing socially directed climate change adaptation. And the results can be used to select locations for specific examination. It can be combined with other investigations about infrastructure and resource capacity in a region or a community when we are trying to respond to these changing conditions at the coast. And they can also be used to inform emergency response and preparedness. We did this work in 2015 using data from the 2011 census, but you can do it. We could do it for subsequent years or even go back in time and look at previous census years. And that allows us to both track changing patterns of social vulnerability and also to see how our interventions, especially in the social realm, are improving and reducing vulnerability of our population. So I'm happy to answer questions about our case study and the population health risks from climate change impacts in the question period. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Patricia. So our final speakers before the first Q&A period are Dr. James Steenberg and Shannon Medema. So James is a senior research forester with the Nova Scotia Department of Lands and Forestry and is an adjunct professor at Dalhousie University's School for Resources and Environmental Studies. And Shannon is Halifax Regional Municipality's Environmental Performance Officer working on Halifax's Urban Forest Management Plan. Over to you, James.
Thanks so much, Raisa. I was thrilled to be part of this process on behalf of my department, which is now called the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables. And I was involved in looking at the natural resource sectors, specifically looking at forestry, agriculture, and fisheries, where we know there's a strong vulnerability to climate change for all the reasons that we know exist for other sectors, but especially because of their very direct and critical reliance on ecosystems and the ecosystem services provided by them, as well as the vulnerability or resilience of these ecosystems in a changing climate. So first, what we did find is the key takeaway message here is that, there is progress. There are adaptation examples on the ground across all 4 Atlantic provinces, and we're seeing good examples, especially on the earlier side of adaptation around research, planning, and even some new policy development. But there's still work to do. We still need progress, especially around coordination across the diversity of stakeholders that exists in these resource sectors. We can look first to forestry, where my expertise is in. And we know that forestry faces a challenge with climate change because of its long time horizons that are involved in planning and large spatial scales. So a lot of the adaptation work that we've seen locally has been involved in that research and planning area. For example, there was a regional integrated assessment in the Maritimes called a short form of MARIA. And it looked at first integrating climate change effects on forest growth and forest succession in New Brunswick into the long-term planning models. And these are key for things such as wood supply, for example, under climate change. Similar research has happened in Newfoundland, and Again, here in Nova Scotia, this is being integrated as we speak into research and modeling practices, as well as locally here in Nova Scotia. We've had the launch of a new climate adaptation leadership program looking at developing an adaptation strategy for our natural resource sector. And a key thing always in adaptation in forestry is looking at assisted migration. And here really from a research perspective, as part of a national research network called Silva 21, where we're on a broad speaking basis trying to ensure that the trees that we're planting today in the forest sector are suited to the climate of the future. Moving into agriculture, where we're dealing with much shorter time horizons, even annual, and there's been really strong exposure and vulnerability to changes in weather patterns and climate and even new pests. And again, there are these local examples of adaptation that we're seeing to these kinds of challenges. For example, the Alternative Land Use Services Program on Prince Edward Island is focused on really incentivizing and implementing farm scale practices to increase the resilience to climate change, among other challenges facing agriculture. In Nova Scotia, there was a climate change risk assessment that was focused on the wine grape industry by the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, which of course is important, and many other local examples. But again, we see here in things like agriculture where that coordination is so essential. Moving to fisheries, where a new challenge and a new risk from climate change to layer on top of these existing ones is the fact of increasing storm level and increasing sea level and more severe winter storms, especially over the ocean, where now we're looking at vulnerability and risks to coastal infrastructure and even the safety of workers within that sector. Adaptation is critical for these areas and has examples occurring. For example, in New Brunswick, in Grand Manan Island, there was risk assessments done under different climate change scenarios for future needs, such as coastal infrastructure like wharves and their adaptation needs for different storm severities. Also, there's been research associated with aquaculture, and a lot of this is at the research stage here around adaptation and collaboration between industry and universities to deal with challenges like changing sea temperatures and changing sea chemistry. To close, we know that there could be opportunities around climate change, with longer growing seasons and possibilities of new crop species, for example. Even some sectors like forestry can help mitigate climate change, but we know that climate change threats and negative effects are real. They exist today and will continue to exist. Adaptation is critical. And as always in the natural resource sectors, uncertainty is one of the biggest enemies to adaptation. Thank you.
Over to you, Shannon.
Thanks so much. Shannon Medema. I'm actually the manager of environment and climate change for the city of Halifax. Environmental performance officer is what I started as 12 years ago, actually this month. So happy to just talk briefly about the urban forest master plan that we have here in Halifax. It was adopted in 2012 by regional council. And since then we've planted about 15,000 trees. It focuses on increasing tree canopy overall in the urban environment, but also species diversity, pruning approaches. So we've moved from a proactive pruning process, or from a reactive to a proactive pruning process. And it really was a really great partnership with academics, with the municipal government and other partners in the public to put the plan together and then continuously implement it. It has struggled from getting the amount of resources it needs year over year to hit the tree targets and the pruning targets. But we have just recently adopted a new climate plan here called Halifax, Acting on Climate Together, that was passed in early pandemic days of June 2020 by regional council. And we brought adaptation into our climate plan. We have mitigation and adaptation together as one. We didn't separate them as has been done in the past. And the focus on increased climate risks and the need to adapt has really helped strengthen the argument for increasing the funding for implementing the urban forest master plan year over year. And some of the climate budget that we had this year actually went towards increasing the number of trees that we were able to plant, which is really great. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Great, so it's now time for our first Q&A session. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers so far, you can type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And our first question is for Fiona. So Fiona, what are the youth strategies for Canada in a changing climate? There's no curriculum for these competencies, and wondering how youth can become more aware of these perspectives.
Sorry, I'm in trouble with my screen. Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that we are aware we need to do more on. We've done a few initiatives, and I think 2015, 2016, we worked with the Royal Canadian Geographic Society to produce a series of infographics and lesson plans, and those are still available on their website. Realizing that the information on those is getting out of date, we are working with another group now, I think Learning for Sustainable Futures, to develop a series of videos for older students looking at how adaptation can be, or why adaptation should be considered in different careers, as well as a number of resources for younger students, the K-6 age. And those should be available April, May of 2022. Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. Okay, so we have a question here for Patricia. So the idea of understanding vulnerable populations is really important. Can you make some suggestions on how research can be turned into adaptation action?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, that's it's an important one to think about, how that information can be turned, to something that actually reduces vulnerability. So the measures are in this mapping of indices are focusing on demographics, social condition, and economic aspects of the population. And so when we see an area where vulnerability is high, we can actually dig deeper into the index and identify which of the factors contributing to the index may be pushing that vulnerability in a higher direction. And if it's age, there's not too much you can do about that. But because the idea that, as a population of a older age cohort is going to be somewhat more vulnerable than one with a better mix. However, can't do anything about age, but you can encourage a better mix of the population. So encouraging immigration of younger people and families into an area, for example, has the effect of lowering the vulnerability, especially if you're providing good income and economic opportunity in that area. So it's a case of really identifying, what are your social strategies for building resilience and lowering this social vulnerability. And you can do this at a high level, regionally, nationally, but it works, and provincially, you can look at these areas across the province to actually target areas for interventions of that nature. Or you can also then identify where the vulnerable areas are relative to these hazards and be, more strategic in directing supports for withstanding these storms, for example, ensuring that adequate enough information is getting through to people in maybe languages that people don't, if you have an area where people have limited knowledge of English or French, new immigrants, for example, making sure that that information is provided to them in ways that are easily accessible to them, socially and linguistically. So it's an informative tool, but you do have to plan and build strategies around it.
Thanks, Patricia. So the next question here is for James, and it's from Andy. So Andy asks, other than aquaculture, what's the vulnerability of catch-based fisheries to increasing sea surface temperatures and acidity?
Yeah, I'll try and answer that the best that I can, but I don't have the background in fisheries or aquaculture. But a number of changing vulnerabilities that were found in amongst our team of authors, and some of them include the changing water temperatures and mixing of the Gulf Stream. That's certainly been an issue. And ocean acidification, and just these trophic scale impacts of climate change on the actual population of fisheries. And that it's a challenge because there's these ecosystem level vulnerabilities that we know we're going to see in all ecosystems that have a resource sector associated with them, which more likely than not will lead to adverse effects and declines in stocks for the most part. But fisheries, we were seeing on top of that layering of those ecosystem impacts and need for adaptation was these additional challenges around infrastructure and safety. But there was some examples, I believe, of increasing number of fish that are not typically part of managed stocks in the region, and some potential climate change opportunities there, but certainly challenges will likely outweigh that.
Great, thank you, James. So our next question is for Shannon. So one of the participants is asking, is Halifax planning to take advantage of the federal 2 billion trees program? And what sort of provincial federal supports are you receiving with regards to urban forestry?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I am not the urban forester, so I'm not on the up and up, but I know that we certainly would be looking to participate in the 2 billion tree initiative, and we're always looking for funding support from both the feds and the province. I don't think we currently have any support from other levels of government for the urban forest master plan. It's all being managed municipally.
I can just add, having some involvement with urban forestry research program, that those conversations are in place, and the municipal urban forester has been speaking with the provincial department of natural resources and renewables around the 2 billion trees initiative, and we're hopeful for collaboration there to strengthen resources for municipal urban forests like those in Halifax.
Great, thanks both of you. So then we have another question that we'd like to adapt the social vulnerability map for clean energy securities. For example, wind atlas mapping, solar mapping, and microhydro mapping that doesn't include dams, which would help in future clean energy projects. So this is for any of you. Does anyone know if there are case studies that would be related to this? If anyone has thoughts, just jump in here.
Sorry, do you have the question again, or is it written down? I just wanted to take a better look at it.
I think it's in the chat. I'm just looking. So it's from Kevin G in the chat. He says, we'd like to adapt a social vulnerability map for clean energy securities. For example, wind atlas mapping, solar mapping, and microhydro mapping, which would help in future clean energy projects. And so does anyone know if there's any case studies that would help with this?
That's a great idea, but I don't know if any case studies done on that. So there's an opportunity to start one, I would say. It could be an interesting one to look at, providing. So if you're looking at social vulnerability, I'm just jumping in here with a thought, but if you're looking at social vulnerability, higher vulnerability, that might imply, stresses on being able to afford energy. So if you were to develop something where you could, under, I guess, provincial regulations and utilities, supplement or at a local level energy supply with renewables, that could be quite an exciting opportunity to particular populations. Just a thought.
Yeah, great. Anyone else have thoughts on that question? I can't see you all, so if you do, just jump in. Okay, so then we have another question to the panel, but maybe we'll start with Sabina. Atlantic Canada is well known for having a strong sense of community, bringing people together and storytelling, not to mention kitchen parties. So is there evidence of people drawing upon those strengths to build climate change resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Raisa. Absolutely. So we're not yet at key message 5, which talks about adaptive capacity, which is really based on the strong sense of community, the strong sense of collaboration, being innovative in the face of lack of resources, both human resources as well as financial resources. And that is why there is really a key message 5, is because it's so strong in this region. So thanks for that question.
I could add to it as well.
Yeah,
go ahead,
absolutely.
sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm done.
I was just going to say that there's examples of that culture of collaboration, in the forest sector as well, where in Atlantic Canada, unlike the rest of the country, a lot, and sometimes even the majority, as is the case in Nova Scotia, of the working forest is small woodlots, not large areas of crown land. And so that requires tremendous amount of coordination to implement any kind of adaptation measures, just given the scale of forests and the scale of these small woodlots. And there's examples, and a recent one in New Brunswick, I believe, are around some climate change adaptation planning and outreach, education, and webinars and these kinds of things, which have been great.
Yeah, Patricia, did you want to speak to that one as well?
Yeah, I think this is a really good example of how important it is to, when you're looking at maps like the one I showed and identifying areas of vulnerability, social vulnerability, to drill down into the area specifically and to make it a place-based examination, because it might suggest a higher level of vulnerability based on statistics, but then when you look at what's actually happening in the community, you may discover, as we often do, especially around social connectivity, that there is a lot going on. And that can be very supportive and actually lowering the vulnerability. And that's not something that these statistics measure. So it's really important to be able to identify those attributes on the ground.
Great, thanks. So I just want to make a note. There's been a couple of questions, one from Brian and one from Nicole, about modeling. We're going to bump those forward to one of the Q&A sessions later on in the webinar, because it will be more relevant at that point. But I do want to end this Q&A session with one last question from Don Jardine, who says, are we looking at the vulnerability of our infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, coastal structures, to our changing climate to help avoid issues recently experienced in BC, Cape Breton, and Newfoundland? So a question around vulnerability of infrastructure. I don't know who wants to tackle that one.
I can jump in on that one just from a Halifax perspective. That is one of the 7 critical areas of focus for us in implementing our climate plan. So we have a whole new LiDAR set, new digital elevation and surface models. Before we had a subset of our municipality, now it covers the entire 5,400 square kilometers in HRM. And we're localizing the assessment report 6 predictions that came up from the IPCC, and we're going to be doing climate hazard mapping, and then layering our critical infrastructure on top, and then looking at the highest risk and vulnerability of that critical infrastructure and prioritizing work going forward and seeking funding to support that work.
Thanks, Shannon.
And just to follow up on that, some of the key infrastructure, they are being looked at, for example, the Chignecto Isthmus area. So there's ongoing studies and work to identify the risk to that infrastructure. And I'll talk a bit later about that as well.
Okay, and Patricia, you want to say something on that one too?
Yeah, and in Nova Scotia, I mean, in the early 2013 period, during the time when we were developing the municipal climate change action plans, there was a lot of investigation of local infrastructure, critical in relation to flood hazard, erosion hazard, flood hazard in particular. So there are many examples of that having been done, but we now, I think all the provinces will or have already got updated flood mapping at the coast and in floodplains, river floodplains. So that's going to be really important to look at that at an even finer scale than what we were able to do 10 years ago almost. So, but there are examples out there for sure.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to move on now. Thank you all for your questions. Just a note, we do have 2 more Q&A periods throughout the webinar, so please continue to add your questions into the Q&A box. And if we don't get to your question, you might want to add your email address as well to your question, just in case we don't have time to get to it, then someone can follow up with you by email. So just to move on to our next segment here, I'd like to now introduce Hope Parnham and Adam Cheeseman. Hope is the Climate Change Policy Advisor with the Prince Edward Island Department of Environment, Energy and Climate Action. And Adam is the Director of Conservation at Nature NB, who works on climate change adaptation initiatives.
Hi, everyone. Adaptive capacity is the ability of individuals, institutions, and systems to adapt and thrive under changing conditions. But unfortunately, here in Atlantic Canada, many institutions, including our governments and small rural communities, have limited capacity to do so due to constraints caused by limited human and economic resources. As such, building partnerships and collaboration between different stakeholders has been very important for driving adaptation and building our adaptive capacity across this region. Across Atlantic Canada, provincial governments have supported municipalities and partnerships with NGOs and universities to deliver outreach programs. The success of community-based adaptive capacity building is directly linked to outreach, public education, and effective communication. Public outreach and education sessions occur regularly throughout the region and engage a wide variety of public interest groups. These initiatives are often led by community champions and involve strategic partnerships with research institutions. To assess the effectiveness of these types of collaboration efforts, 3 adaptation initiatives in New Brunswick were analyzed by surveying the stakeholders involved. The participants were asked to identify the qualities of collaboration that they thought were most important to the process and the outcomes resulting from the collaboration that resonated most strongly with them. The network diagram shown here illustrates the relationship between those collaborative qualities and the outcomes of collaboration. This case story shows how collaborative initiatives can be used to effectively identify region-specific vulnerabilities and inform climate change adaptation action plans. They also show how individuals with various backgrounds can work together to address complex problems and develop more robust adaptation measures. While public outreach opportunities traditionally help to educate the public about the science and risks of climate change, more recently, the public engagement initiative have shifted towards discussions about community adaptation options. To aid communication and effectively raise public awareness, these discussions have been assisted by the development of specialized visual and plain language tools, such as flood risk mapping, computer simulations, plain language brochures, and infographics. For example, here in PEI, the provincial government has just recently launched an online interactive coastal hazard information platform, otherwise known as CHIP. The online map allows users to explore PEI's coastline and visualize the impacts of projected sea level rise and storm surge events. The map also includes information on the historic rates of coastal erosion. In addition to the map, the province has also developed supporting tools and resources, including a plain language coastal hazard assessment for property owners, reports on coastal hazard data for design and engineering professionals, and an online course developed in partnership with the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, which provides practical advice to residents on preparing and adapting homes to address coastal hazards. Ultimately, the breadth of tools developed across Atlantic Canada have proven to be effective at enhancing communication on climate change risks, engaging stakeholders in discussions about the role that natural areas can play in reducing vulnerability and enhancing resiliency to climate change across the region. I'll hand things off to Adam now, who will provide additional information about the tools being developed in the other provinces in the region.
Great. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Hope. So yes, as mentioned, we have a number of examples of collaboration and collaborative climate projects in the region. Many of these collaborative efforts have resulted in the development of useful tools and resources that help facilitate things like knowledge sharing and awareness raising, and ultimately the communication of complex scientific information on climate change to the public and other sectors. And in many cases, these tools and resources help to allow different sectors or organizations or individuals understand what some of the challenges and opportunities are in the region to advance action. And so I'll just chat about a few examples from some of the other Atlantic provinces to showcase some of these great efforts. So the image on the left-hand side of this slide, in New Brunswick since 2018, the New Brunswick Environmental Network and a number of other partners, including HRMB, has been leading the development of the natural and nature-based climate change adaptation community of practice. And that's funded through NRCan's BRACE program. And the project works collaboratively with government planners and engineers and nonprofits to build capacity and expertise on nature-based adaptation. And we have this web platform, which is shown here, where professionals and also the public can learn about case studies through an interactive map, access training tools and resources, and connect with each other through this platform and through this online community. So it's about kind of bringing people together to through this tool to help with knowledge sharing. In Newfoundland Labrador, there's the Turn Back the Tide tool, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, which communicates the climate change impacts in very clear ways, while also providing tips for homeowners, municipalities, and others. And it's a very easy tool for accessing information to support action on the ground. So it's just another example. Meanwhile, in Nova Scotia Environment's Climate Change Division, and this is mentioned in the chapter as well, is implementing a climate adaptation leadership program. And that's focused on building adaptive capacity within provincial government departments using a learn by doing framework in which teams will work together to develop and implement climate change adaptation strategies. In 2016, Nature and Bee and a number of our partners also led an initiative across the maritime provinces, looking at how we can use land use mapping and simple mapping tools to engage communities and engage smaller nonprofits on discussions around ecosystem services and climate change in order to better understand where impacts were being felt and how nature could be a part of these solutions. And so particularly with the emergence of new technologies and ways of working, Atlantic Canadian organizations and climate leads continue to innovate and explore how different tools and resources can enhance our climate work and foster collaboration moving forward. And we've also seen the success of these collaborative initiatives grow and morph into new sectors and new opportunities. So for example, just recently, the New Brunswick Climate Change Adaptation Collaborative, coordinated by the New Brunswick Environmental Network, recently hosted a climate change conference from the agricultural perspective that explored how we can better collaborate on climate change with farmers and agriculture organizations. And so with all those different partners in attendance, they were all contributing to that discussion. And I think that our tools and resources and our ability to willingly collaborate with one another is a real, reflects in a lot of the success of what we're doing here. And so while challenges remain, the breadth of tools, innovative spirit, and willingness to collaborate continues to be a strong point for players in the region. And I think that this strong network of social capital that we've built and are continuing to build will continue to pay significant dividends as we face down the impacts of climate change to come. And so there's lots of other examples of some of these tools and resources that you can explore in the chapter, and happy to answer any other questions during the second question period. So thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, Adam and Hope. So our next presentation is from Peter Nishimura and Dr. Danica Van Proosty. So Peter is the Senior Climate Change Adaptation Policy Advisor with the PEI Department of Environment, Energy and Climate Action. And Danica is a coastal geomorphologist and professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at St. Mary's University. Over to you both.
Great, thanks, Raisa. As is mentioned in the report, Atlantic Canada as a region includes about 42,000 kilometers of coastline. So, of course, it's very much subject to coastal impacts. And increasingly, we're seeing coastal flooding resulting from storm surge, especially in low-lying areas, coastal erosion, which will accelerate with sea level rise, and reductions in sea ice. And then in addition to these coastal hazards, the region's also challenged by overland flooding resulting from snowmelt and rain. And we expect that with earlier spring melts and increased runoff into river systems, that risk of flooding will increase. And since we tend to like to live and work and play near the water, these impacts pose a risk to us and also to the infrastructure that enables so much of our economic activity and social activity. The severity of the impacts can vary across the region, of course, but with so much of our development and our infrastructure and our economic activity, much of it located at the water or near the water, it's not hard to see the risk to public safety and the delivery of core services, especially in areas where we've got critical infrastructure, such as single points of access. And the Chignecto Isthmus certainly comes to mind in that regard. So in terms of adaptation to these impacts, there are a few tools and approaches that can be highlighted as ways that we can try to reduce risk. As an example, flood hazard maps have come up today and have really taken on more prominence regionally and nationally, really, in light of recent events, as a foundational piece for identifying at-risk infrastructure and then using that information to prioritize adaptation. And each of the Atlantic provinces have made progress in this area. Here in PEI, we've recently released provincial flood hazard maps. And the next step, of course, is to see this kind of information integrated into decision-making, infrastructure-related decision-making, development-related decision-making. And that can happen at the provincial level or at the municipal level. And each of the Atlantic provinces has signaled an intent to do that to various degrees. One of the predominant approaches historically to coastal impacts has been the use of engineered solutions, especially what we'd refer to as hard approaches like armor stone or seawalls. But these approaches increasingly are being recognized as being not the only tool in the toolbox. And that's helped to increase the prominence of using more natural elements as a way to deal with the impacts of flooding and erosion. And one example of that is in the town of Surrey, PEI. The town of Surrey relies on a single causeway, and which is fronted by a beach. And that causeway acts as both a conduit to and through the town. And it is also itself a tourism destination. And it's had a pretty long history of both erosion and that conventional hard engineering. But in 2018, the province piloted an installation of Intertidal Reefs. And the reefs are designed to act as a barrier to slow down wave energy, which acts to protect the causeway and encourages deposition behind. And that's helping already to build up the beach there and preserve that feature and that causeway and that tourism asset. So the reefs themselves are constructed using local island sandstone. So it's blended nicely with the surrounding area. And it's really established. It's being used as an example for other installations on PEI as well already, such as at West Point at the other end of the island. So it really reflects an emerging acceptance of nature-based approaches to flood and erosion hazards in Atlantic Canada, and that can also be seen in the prevalence of living shoreline installations that are being undertaken throughout the region. Finally, it's worth noting that within that toolbox of adaptation, retreat and relocation are increasingly being considered, where sort of holding the line isn't tenable. So that's a simpler conversation with infrastructure, but certainly more sensitive in a community setting, and is an area that will need some more attention and consideration as the impacts worsen in the coming years. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. Now over to Danica.
The Making Room for Wetlands project is a collaboration between the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture and Transcoastal Adaptation Center for Nature-Based Solutions at St. Mary's University, funded by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Coastal Restoration Fund. We are developing a framework for managed realignment that is the reintroduction of tidal flow to former agricultural dike lands and the restoration of tidal wetland habitat, and testing it in a series of pilot projects in the Bay of Fundy. Intensive monitoring of these projects has shown us that there is considerable variability in the ease of implementation of these activities and their restoration trajectories. The Belcher Street site, noted on the left, is located on the Cornwallis River, is a mix of active and fallow agricultural lands that are protected by an aging and eroding dike. The landowner voluntarily gave up his land in exchange for better road access to his remaining agricultural land. This provided a win-win scenario for NSDA, decreasing maintenance costs while resolving an eroding dike problem, and the landowner increased protection and quality of the remaining agricultural land, and 6.9 hectares of tidal wetland habitat was restored. Tidal flow was reintroduced in June 2018, dike length reduced by over 500 meters, and we used a living shoreline techniques as an alternative to traditional hard rock armoring for strengthening the remaining foreshore. Significant sedimentation was measured within the first year, which provided a foundation for vegetation growth. 3 years post-restoration, the site is fully vegetated and supports a vibrant tidal wetland ecosystem. The new dike is being used by locals for recreation, and walkers remark on the return of species such as butterflies, rarely seen when fully diked. The converse site, located in the image on the right, located on the Mississauga River at the border between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, included a dike that paralleled the main river channel and was undergoing continuous erosion. Situated within a sensitive cultural and archaeological landscape and contiguous to a National Historic Site, modification of the dike had to ensure the continued protection of the park's land property, as well as its cultural and archaeological features. The project involved a comprehensive archaeological resource impact assessment and engagement with the marsh body and Indigenous groups, all of which influenced the final project design. Construction of the new dike and relocation of a section of road to higher ground was completed in September 2018. Decommissioning of approximately 1 kilometer of dike and removal of Wadiabueto took place in December of that year, returning tidal flow to 15.4 hectares. With lower sedimentation rates, vegetation establishment has been slower. However, within the first year, the muddy surfaces provided food for thousands of migrating shorebirds. This year, we saw significant expansion of vegetation, and detailed monitoring and research is allowing us to better understand the restoration trajectory. Projects like these are becoming larger and more complex, requiring new approaches, processes, and data to be incorporated, and involving stakeholders who have not traditionally been part of the process. Through the reintroduction of tidal flow, managed realignment requires reimagining our coastal landscapes and communities to shift their understanding of how the coast works. Managed realignment is a viable nature-based climate adaptation strategy, and we are demonstrating the success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. So now I'd like to invite back Sabina and Stephanie, who will be discussing knowledge gaps and emerging issues.
Thanks, Reza. So as Fiona mentioned early on in the presentation, this work also involved identifying some pressing knowledge gaps and research needs that we've identified across the different areas of focus. So first, adaptation work would benefit from a better understanding of Indigenous viewpoints and applying a more holistic and interdisciplinary approach. And while two-eyed seeing has been successfully used to take on complex challenges, non-Indigenous groups need to ensure that the use of this approach is respectful and in collaboration with Indigenous partners. Next, our group also identified that there needs to be more tools to develop monitoring and evaluation approaches of work that's going on. This would allow practitioners and decision makers to understand how effective and efficient their works and efforts were. This way, they can identify additional work that's required to meet any gaps or opportunities to improve for future work. There's also a recognition that planning and budgeting for adaptation needs to become more proactive rather than reactive. This lowers the cost-benefit ratio of the adaptation programs, something that the National Issue Reports covers in greater detail, and there's a link to this work within our chapter. And lastly, any planned and proactive relocation is an issue that has been broached a number of times within Atlantic Canada over the past few decades. Some outcomes were positive, while others had animosity still harboring. So as flooding and erosion risks increase, these conversations at the community level are expected to become more commonplace.
Thanks, Stephanie. Over to you, Sabina.
Raisa and Stephanie. So we've identified a number of emerging issues that are of concern for the region. One of them is just the sheer pace of change that is happening, and the diversity, frequency, and the unpredictability. Anyway, I'm not getting this today, of the events that are occurring, such as what you've just seen, or what we've just seen with the heavy precipitation events that washed out the Trans-Canada Highway in Newfoundland. The need to be just simply more proactive and to equip policymakers with the tools that they need to make informed decisions. We also identified the need to work to conduct further research on the impacts on nature of climate change. The natural systems play a key role in supporting our own resiliency and are directly linked to us, as you've heard already today. And we're only starting to learn and understand those impacts. And there are some initiatives underway to protect natural areas, natural systems, and those definitely need to start incorporating climate change considerations. But we also noted that there's a lack of expertise and resources in the area. In terms of the complexity in working in several jurisdictions, there's a good example of the Chignecto Isthmus crossing both, included in both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Those types of critical infrastructures that are shared across jurisdictions, with those the challenges can be considerable. As you may remember, that the isthmus carries 50 million of trade across the isthmus. It's a very similar piece of infrastructure as was just washed out in BC, where trade was interrupted for days. But it's not clear who would pay, who decides what happens with this infrastructure, how to prepare for events, what about food security, and what about alternate plans? All of those are big questions. We've also identified the lack of adaptation planning for new developments as an emerging issue. While we note that tools have been developed, there were also few regulations and policies that have been implemented to avoid developments in those particularly vulnerable locations. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sabina and Stephanie. So it's now time for our second question period. If you have any questions, please again put them into the Q&A box and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So our first one is coming in here from Terry Thibodeau, and it's for Peter. So Peter, are there any examples of the use of eelgrass as a mitigation effort?
Good question. I'm actually not familiar with any use of that. There may be some local watershed groups that have tried that, but it's not something that we with the province have been involved in directly.
Any of our other panelists have an answer to that one about eelgrass?
Yes, so in New Brunswick, there are some watershed groups that have worked on that. I think the Shediac Bay Watershed Association is one of them. And there are some others across the region, some Indigenous communities up north as well, on the Bay Chaleur.
Yeah, I can speak to that. There's actually on the Baptouche River as well, First Nations involved with that.
Great. Okay, so we have a question. Oh, someone else want to answer? I thought I heard something. No. Okay. Okay, so question for Danica. So what are the key elements, some key elements for implementing the projects, like the projects that you were talking about, and where do you see making room going in the future?
Well, thanks for that question. I think some of the key elements are definitely communication and partnerships and collaboration, and having everyone at the table when you start implementing, and all the players at the table that are going to be potentially impacted. And I think that's what's allowed these projects to go ahead. And we are looking at other areas, but as part of one of the tools in the toolbox, in conjunction with the province, where managed realignment is one option, but so is going to be raising dikes or modifying where they're located in the future as you respond to climate change impacts.
Great, and I just saw that Adam also shared some information about that eelgrass question in the chat. So that's for Terry. So Danica, another question here for you from Frank Johnson. Has the Netherlands Room for the River program informed any regional adaptation planning? It balances hard and natural infrastructure approaches.
Yes, it absolutely has, and actually was sort of the foundation stimulus for our Making Room for Wetlands project and Making Room for Movement project, which was funded by NRCan, which really is looking at that, providing that natural dynamic space for the coast to respond to the various forcing functions, and look at the interaction between our activities at the coast and reimagining what that landscape would look like if we allow for that dynamic coastal processes to actually take place.
Great. So just wondering, and I see there's more eelgrass comments in the chat, so that's obviously, there's lots going on there. So some of you mentioned some nature-based approaches and that they could be used. So what are some limitations of nature-based approaches? And that's for anyone that wants to answer.
I can jump in on that. Nature-based approaches, as with any approach, they need to be paired and matched with the environmental conditions at that location. So in an area that perhaps is highly exposed to wave energy, doesn't have a lot of sediment supply, those might be areas where it may be more challenging. And in those kind of cases, there still are alternatives that can incorporate a nature-based element and referred to as hybrid solutions, where you may need to have a more engineered solution at one area to create that sheltered region behind. So it's really matching the nature-based approach with the environmental conditions that are in the ground to ensure the longer-term sustainability of the application of that approach.
I could add to that as well regarding nature-based solutions, whereas in the forest sector, the focus so much on nature-based solutions to climate change is carbon. You know, sequestering and storing carbon in forests and in forest products, and offsetting other more carbon-intensive materials in other sectors. But what I see as a big threat to that nature-based solution, which is why I'm really encouraged by this process of the this report and all the work that goes into it, is so much emphasis on climate change mitigation, which is critical. We need that, but without adapting our forests and our forest sector to climate change, because we'll lose out on those carbon benefits and those nature-based solutions to climate change if we don't also adapt.
Great, thank you. So here's a question from Andy and it's for everyone. So in regards to relocation, have there been any examples of local or provincial governments enforcing or enabling movement of homes or restriction of development?
There is, our chapter does reference where provincial help, I think finances were really critical in a community that was able to move, and that was the one that didn't have as much animosity. So if you refer to the chapter, there's a few details and resources that did refer to a case where that did happen.
Anyone else want to share anything about the governments enforcing or enabling movements of homes or restrictions of development?
Yeah, I can speak for PEI, at least within our context. There is incorporation of erosion hazard into development control in coastal areas. So if the erosion risk is considered high, that the setback is increased for development along the coast. But currently, there's nothing. There's no restrictions based on the flood hazard.
Yep, similarly in New Brunswick, restrictions on developments, but there have been some relocations that have occurred. The last flood along Perth Andover, there were some homes moved out of the St. John River, the big St. John River flood, I think in 2018. The same thing, some voluntary relocations occurred there.
Great. Okay, so I just want to check. Margot Shepherd is asking if there's any guidance to municipalities in terms of liability and approving development in flood-prone areas, or case studies, anything like that. That's to anyone.
I'm not aware of any liability, but I think the discussions that we've been having with local communities here are really more about the liability of not disclosing the flood risk. So the issue isn't if you approve it in a floodplain, but if you have not informed them and it's a known floodplain. So that was our approach in making our new floodplain maps as available as possible, and getting them not just online for access by the public, but delivering them and presenting that information to the municipalities and local professionals working along coastal properties.
Anyone else have thoughts on that, about liabilities for municipalities with issuing building permits? No. Okay, so we have another question here. Are there any measures being discussed for protecting inland watersheds, rivers, and lakes, removal of dams, that sort of thing? It could be anyone. No one wants to take a stab at that one. Okay, we'll go to the next one, which will be the last one in this session, which is from Don Jardine again. How engaged are the respective transportation departments in addressing the risks posed by climate change? So in the different provinces.
I can speak with some of the work that we've been doing with Department of Transportation in the Nova Scotia sector. They are quite engaged in looking at infrastructure with the climate lens, and certainly considering changing sizes when they're doing replacement, changing sizes of culverts, for example, to reflect increased higher discharge event, and the actual bed of the road to be modified. Some areas where they've been doing active twinning on the highways, they have factored in the future sea level rise elevations, and so are making sure that those surfaces are above future projected sea level rise levels.
Thanks, Danica. And that's Nova Scotia, right?
That's in Nova Scotia, yes.
Yeah. So any other provincial government transportation involvement that anyone wants to speak to?
Yeah, I can speak for PEI. You know, we have a really good relationship with our Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, and they've shown a real interest in getting the latest information we have so that they can incorporate that into their design. And it's a process, but it's certainly the interest and the eagerness is there the recognition that design and location needs to consider these factors.
Great. Okay, thank you everyone for, oh, sorry, did I hear someone?
I was just going to say that on the New Brunswick side, I'm pretty sure that the Department of Transportation was leading the Chignecto study to look at the potential flooding and engineering options along the Chignecto Isthmus as the border between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on now. Thank you everyone for your questions. And again, we do have one more Q&A session at the very end of the webinar. And again, if your questions haven't been answered, you can also share your email address with us and someone will get back to you via email. So thanks everyone. This was the section where we were launching the Atlantic Provinces chapter of Canada in a Changing Climate Regional Perspectives report. And we're now going to move on to the next segment of the webinar, which is to present Atlantic Canada's new climate services hub, CLIMAtlantic.
In St. John, but the mayor has just declared a state of emergency.
Brunswick needed a break today. It didn't happen.
The Halifax area where the storm is making landfall.
The island is losing square meters every year.
People living in Atlantic Canada are experiencing climate change. We know it is already impacting our communities, our health, our environment, and our way of life.
You just look anywhere around the world and you see climate catastrophe unfolding.
Au Nouveau-Brunswick, le bassin du fleuve Saint-Jean a subi de graves inondations à l'intérieur des terres. En 2018 seulement, 12 000 propriétés ont été touchées, entraînant des dommages s'élevant à plus de 80 millions de dollars. We know that the dikes protecting the land bridge between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are insufficient. More than $50 million of goods cross here daily, and one bad storm could cause serious damages. En 2020, St. John's, Terre-Neuve, a été secouée par un blizzard record qui a laissé dans son sillage plus de 75 cm de neige et des vents de 160 km/h. Le blizzard a causé des dommages de 25 millions de dollars. Coastal erosion on Prince Edward Island is claiming about 30 centimeters per year, and over 1,000 buildings are at risk. Personne ne veut plus entendre de mauvaises nouvelles, mais les changements climatiques sont là et leur impact sera encore plus important. Atlantic Canadians are hardworking, resourceful, and resilient people. We can adapt, but where do we start? If you're making decisions for yourself, your community, or your business, you need to integrate climate change into every decision you make. It's that simple. CLIMAtlantic est la nouvelle plateforme des services climatiques au Canada Atlantique. Nous disposons d'un réseau de spécialistes de l'adaptation au changement climatique prêts à vous aider à élaborer votre plan pour notre climat futur. Veuillez consulter le site www.climatlantic.ca pour obtenir de plus amples renseignements.
Atlantic Canada has seen extensive adaptation work across all the various areas, from research, data compilation and downscaling, development of visualization and other tools, as well as extensive capacity building projects, both aimed at sectors as well as topics and themes. Since the NRCan Atlantic chapter was started in 2018, work in Atlantic Canada has only expanded, and the number of practitioners active in this field has increased exponentially. The need to have access across the region to accurate and pertinent climate data and information is a priority. So in 2018, the Government of Canada launched Environment and Climate Change Canada's Canadian Centre for Climate Services, which supports the establishment of regional hubs across the country. The Atlantic Provinces chapter of Canada in a Changing Climate Regional Perspectives report provides a baseline of information on impacts and adaptation in Atlantic Canada, and CLIMAtlantic is the next logical step, implementing a regional organization to support Atlantic Canadians in incorporating climate data and information in adaptation decision-making. So I'd like to invite Dr. Heather Morrison to say a few words. Heather is the Acting Executive Director with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, which is leading the development of a national network of regional organizations across the country, and CLIMAtlantic is a key component of this network. So over to you, Heather.
Thank you, Reza. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to learn more about these two exciting initiatives in Atlantic Canada. I'd like to acknowledge that I am living and working in the traditional unceded territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. As indicated by Reza, the Government of Canada is committed to creating a strong network of regional climate service organizations across the country to ensure citizens have access to locally relevant expertise, advice, and information needed to adapt to a changing climate. The CCCS has been working closely with Atlantic Provincial colleagues since 2017 to support the establishment of a regional climate service organization in Atlantic Canada. Recognizing that diverse ecosystems and climate zones create unique regional realities within Atlantic Canada, it was important for us to collaboratively design a concept for an organization that could respond to the unique needs within each jurisdiction. As such, a model was developed whereby there would be a central hub organization with nodes in each Atlantic province to provide on-the-ground support and delivery of climate services. CLIMAtlantic joins the national network of regional climate organizations that includes Aranos in Quebec, the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium in British Columbia, and Climate West in the Prairies. Together, these regional organizations work with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services to provide Canadians with information and support to better integrate climate change into decision-making. We are thrilled that CLIMAtlantic is officially launching today. Thank you so much for being here today, and back to you, Reza.
Thanks very much, Heather. So now I'd like to invite Sabina back to introduce CLIMAtlantic.
Yeah, thank you, Heather and Reza. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about, it won't take very much time, but really just explain a little bit about what CLIMAtlantic is and how we will advance adaptation in Atlantic Canada. Next slide, please. We are a nonprofit organization formed just this spring in June, and our primary goal is to work in collaboration with and in support of existing initiatives. So we're not planning to duplicate or to start anything new without that collaboration in place. Our mandate is very clear. It's to deliver climate services driven by user needs, so what is needed in the region. We are also to provide access to climate information and build local capacity and offer training and support. And any time we would offer that, it would be in collaboration with other organizations or it would build on already existing training and support that's in place across the region. Next slide, please. A little bit about how we will do that, how we will carry out our mandate. Next. Thanks. So I thought that I had removed that animation. So one of the things we are doing is locating data. We want to facilitate access to data and interpret data for those that need it. We are responding to requests for data and information, and we have been doing that for a while now. We will jointly develop tools or adapt tools that are already in existence or need updating or are being developed by others for regional and local use. We do have a website that's come online just about a week ago. It's easy access, it's bilingual, and it will link to tools, data, and information, and it's a work in progress. The website as well is based and will be based on the needs identified by users. And users is really anybody who needs information to make better decisions on adaptation. We will provide curated access to information, resources, tools, and guidelines. So we will make sure that what we present either in person or on our website or in events is accurate and follows certain guidelines. We have and are continuing to identify needs across the region, across all sectors and with sectors. Our goal is to collaborate on any training or mentoring with regional organizations. And as I've mentioned before, that the last 10 years have seen, 10 and more years have seen a lot of work across the region that cover all of the steps in the adaptation cycle. We will also provide information about partners, collaborators, and service providers. You will not currently find that on our website, but that is the plan. And then we'll also plan to collaborate on projects, on project delivery, and on the development of project ideas. So we're happy to listen to any ideas that are out there and support applications that organizations or institutions are doing, which we've already been doing for the last months. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, our website is live, CLIMAtlantic.ca. It will provide access, or it's already providing access to general information about climate change, risks, impacts, adaptation, and of course, links to the various data sources that we're starting with. Next slide, please. And one of those I would just like to point out is climatedata.ca. I'd encourage you very strongly to go to the site. It has a lot of information for localized climate indicators, including sea level rise for the coastline, including temperature and precipitation indicators, all based on the 5th IPCC report and being updated currently with the IPCC data that will be incorporated into climatedata.ca. Next slide, please. I also would like to thank supporting organizations, the Environment and Climate Change Canada and the 4 provinces, as well as the founding organizations. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is a very short introduction, and I feel like it's more important for you to have a look at the website and then, ask any questions that you'd like to ask. We've moved some of the questions from the previous session into this question period, so we may as well start there.
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Sabine. So it is time now for our final Q&A period. So again, we do have quite a few that have already come in, but if you have other questions, you can feel free to put them into the Q&A section of your screen. So we'll start off with these questions from Brian and Nicole from earlier, which is, has there been modeling of coastal erosion or flooding for all of Atlantic Canada showing high risk areas? And then if so, is this 3D modeling, is the data managed centrally, and is the data publicly available?
And I can answer part of that. So not for all of Atlantic Canada. There has been coastal erosion, flooding in areas. There has been, coastal erosion as well as flooding in certain areas. Both New Brunswick and PEI have that. PEI currently, the coastal flooding is publicly available, as Peter mentioned earlier. 3D modeling, some organizations are doing 3D modeling. So this is more a visual way of putting yourself in a place and getting that experience of what happens when there is sea level rise. Is the data managed centrally? No. Some of the data is definitely managed by the provinces, but it's all based on similar ones. There's data portals for PEI, there's data portals for New Brunswick, where you can access some of the data. And is this publicly available? It's also a mixed bag. All of this is a mixed bag.
Thank you, Sabine. Okay, so the next question is from Terry Thibodeau. So he's asking if anyone can speak to how these initiatives are being financed, or which federal departments are the go-to funding agencies, and can you provide a list of funders?
Yeah, and that may go to anybody who has had projects funded. And Danica, if you're still on the call, you may want to answer that. One thing that I wanted to just comment on is one of our intent with CLIMAtlantic is as well to have the resources listed, including financial funders across that fund adaptation initiatives, research in Atlantic Canada. So stay tuned, that will be there.
Any other of the speakers want to speak to the financing or the funding? Which federal departments are the go-tos?
Yeah, it really does vary, and most have. There are programs and calls that come out, and it's a matter of really responding to calls. So the Coastal Restoration Fund through DFO has funded a lot of restoration, but also adaptation projects that go along with it. But the primary goal on that one was restoration. NRCan and ECCC also have some funding opportunities that are available. But it really, so things like the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund was just announced earlier. Those are some opportunities. Also, the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, but those are much larger projects, are able to have nature-based solutions associated with it. So it's really, there's not a sustained one location in order to apply for funding, but there are multiple opportunities that are increasingly becoming available. But it really comes down to also partnerships and those collaborations and forming those networks, so that when calls like this come out, which often require matching dollars, that you already have the collaborations in place and you've built those relationships that you're able to respond to a call like that.
Thank you. So the next question is an interesting one. So how much effect did having full forests in Cape Breton affect the amount of water that came down there as compared to what happened in BC 3 weeks ago? So the question around forest cover related to water management in big storms. Who would like to tackle that one?
I'm hoping that James can speak to that.
Yeah, I put an answer in the chat, just forgetting that we're going to have multiple question Q&A sessions there. But my response was really saying that certainly, we've seen that the large-scale natural disturbances, removing forest cover, like the wildfires in BC, exacerbated the flooding, and that trees, forests in forested watersheds at that landscape scale and in more rural areas, help intercept and slow the movement of water through the watershed. And in cities, especially where we have, vulnerability threats and threats to infrastructure from big storm events, urban forest canopy is a key mitigator in those situations as well. So what I was saying is I can't speak exactly to Cape Breton, but I expect that was part of it for sure. But what I also said in my answer is that there's vulnerabilities there too from future disturbances under climate change. For example, spruce bloodworm, while it's not directly linked with climate change, there's linkages. After the previous outbreak in the 70s and 80s of bloodworm, there was such a high mortality rates of balsam fir in the Cape Breton highlands. And a lot of that didn't regenerate because of excessive browsing from moose and the moose being introduced from another part of Canada to Cape Breton. So that, could something like that happening again, for example, with the new spruce bloodworm outbreak that's happening right now in Quebec and being fought off in New Brunswick and Newfoundland, poses future threats to these kinds of flooding impacts that we've seen for sure.
Thanks, James. So a question here about flood mapping plans for Nova Scotia. Sabine, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, and that's just about whether there is any flood mapping plans in existence for Nova Scotia. And so this gives me an opportunity actually to speak a little bit to how CLIMAtlantic will function. So CLIMAtlantic has a core team of I think we're 8 right now, but we also have we will have one provincial specialist in each province. And so currently Nova Scotia already has a provincial specialist, and in Newfoundland, we've got a provincial specialist. They're all part of our team, but they're integrated with other organizations in the province to really bring that provincial perspective to such an Atlantic organization. And so in Nova Scotia, going back to the plans, so there are conversations around flood mapping in Nova Scotia currently going on. So that's the answer to that. And that gave me a good opportunity to talk about actually how we're made up and how we're functioning.
Excellent. Okay, so Kate is asking, Kate says, I recognize the mixed bag in terms of availability, quality, visualization, et cetera, of flood mapping, but is any of this flood mapping being done at the residential scale and designed to inform homeowner decision-making? And will CLIMAtlantic point to what does exist as it comes online if CLIMAtlantic can't host it itself?
Yeah, so this is a mixed bag, and you're right that flood mapping is a bit messy at this time. So one of the roles that I see CLIMAtlantic should be doing is to really try to figure out what can be done in terms of making this more accessible to people and making it more consistent across the region. So I am talking with NRCan about that. And of course, we're also talking with the different provinces as an organization, because we're also embedded in the provinces about, what's the best way of visualizing these things. So when it comes to these online tools, definitely, so the CHIP portal that Peter mentioned earlier, the coastal flood risk mapping, we will have that linked to our website. It will be linked through there. We'll make sure that we understand the methodology used behind it. So for any private initiatives or nonprofit or academic initiatives, we need that. So we've got a process established by which we can evaluate what we actually point to. So if there are tools out there that don't follow a scientifically established and acknowledged methodology, then we can share it. But in general, yes, we hope to influence a little bit across in terms of consistency across the Atlantic region. And yes, definitely in terms of just this idea of homeowner decision making. So some of these tools are definitely able to do that. They will be able to do that at a homeowner's level. And I'm not, because I don't quite remember what the PI tool will do, but Peter can talk to that. But there's also other tools that are likely coming into Canada that will perform some sort of role for the real estate sector and homeowners that are planning to buy or sell their property to identify specific risks. And those may be more commercial based. So that there is things in the works that we will, as CLIMAtlantic, we will keep a very close eye on, and we'll make sure we look at those things. And if they are useful, based on scientific modeling, based on solid data, then we will share that across Atlantic Canada through our website. So Peter, maybe you can just briefly touch on a CHIP portal. Would you be able to do that?
Yeah, sorry. So do you mean Peter, its availability or the?
Peter, could you just turn on your video, please, so that we can see you while you're talking?
Yeah, just the question was specifically for identifying the residential scale. So going really down to the homeowner and being able to zoom in and look at, well, my house where is it located? What's the risk or what's the impact? The flood impact, or what's the flood at my house level?
Yeah, so CHIP, this is the public facing platform that anyone can access to view the floodplains and see where their home is. It's one resource that we have here on PEI, and the other piece is that anyone on PEI can request what's called a coastal hazard assessment for their property, and that's where we kind of delve a little deeper and really explain what they're looking at when they see the different coastal floodplains. So present day, 2050, 2100. So the we have some work to do as far as explaining what people are seeing when they pull up those maps. But we do have a few other resources available already, and we can share the links to those.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some questions from Corinne and Paul about the Kanso Causeway. So do you know if there's been studies conducted on the impact of climate change, sea level rise, erosion, et cetera, on the Kanso Causeway between mainland Nova Scotia and Cape Breton? The entire issue of sea level rise and the most sensitive and vulnerable locations, the Kanso Causeway being replaced by a bridge, which is essential for Cape Breton as well as Newfoundland and Labrador. So anyone can speak to that.
And I just thought it would be good to have it out there because, to be really honest, I don't know, but if one of the panelists from Nova Scotia is aware of that, it'd be great to know.
Anyone? Okay, so thanks for that question. Hopefully that just planted seeds though for some folks. So another question for Peter here. So Dr. Adam Fennick and Clive have been critical to identifying at-risk areas. He and his team are able to map out areas that will be affected by sea level rise over time and show it geographically. Has he and his team been involved in the research for decision making?
This particular mapping platform was developed with a different consultant. We do work closely with UPEI though, and I guess the distinction I might make between Clive and CHIP at this point was when Clive was developed, and UPEI can speak to this probably more precisely, but when Clive was developed, it was really intended to be a visualization tool, really to show people where flooding would occur as sea level rises, and looking at especially at some of those more extreme scenarios. What we've tried to do here with CHIP is consider what are the latest projections for where the floodplain will be in 2050 and 2100, less as a visualization tool and more on the decision support side. But to be clear, we work very closely with UPEI and the Climate Lab and Dr. Fennick, and CLIVE is a tool that is probably ready for sort of a 2.0, a next phase, and we'll be happy to work with them on that.
Great, thank you, Peter. And I apologize, there's some work going on outside, so sorry about that. So next question, maybe for Heather. I'm not sure if Heather can answer this, but it's from Katrina. Is there practical advice for the construction industry to be more mindful of these issues that we're talking about? And Heather, if you're there, just please turn on your camera before you answer.
Yeah, so I'm here. So we're doing a lot of work with the infrastructure sector to try and ensure that we have climate data products that suit their needs, that interface well with the kind of metrics they look at when they are trying to make decisions to create climate resilient buildings and other types of infrastructure. We are working on a building sector module for climatedata.ca, which is, if it hasn't been released yet, it will be any day now. Yeah, we do a lot of work with the infrastructure sector at many different scales. So we work with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to basically promote our services and also look at ways to build learning tools and other resources to help the municipal sector make decisions that are resilient. We recently worked with the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario to provide climate data, like bespoke climate data and metrics, to inform an assessment of the relative costs and benefits of retrofitting all of the provincially owned infrastructure in Ontario to be resilient. And they were doing a cost-benefit analysis to look at the cost of doing nothing, of just repairing as things break, and of being proactive. So we really hit at different scales. But climatedata.ca, we are continually working with our partners to enhance the learning tools and the access to climate metrics that, as I said, interface with the kinds of information that sector uses to make climate smart decisions.
Great, thank you so much, Heather. So I think very mindful of the time. That's all the questions we're going to have time to get to today. But if you did share a question that we didn't have time for, again, please share your email address and someone will answer you by email. So thank you all so much for joining us today. These two exciting developments, the release of the Atlantic Provinces chapter of Canada in a Changing Climate Regional Perspectives report and the launch of CLIMAtlantic, both set the stage for Atlantic Canadians to be better able to adapt to our changing climate. And also, just so that you're aware, the webinar was recorded and it will be posted on the Coin Atlantic website and also newsroom, changingclimate.ca, under regional perspectives and under newsroom. Thank you all very much and have a great rest of your day.